Take a look at this scene from the Witcher series, Geralt and Jaskier walking through the countryside. Now compare it to the scene in The Lord of the Rings, when Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli cross the plains of Rohan while tracking the Uruk-hai. In Lord of the Rings, the wind flattens the grass in waves, dust rises underfoot, and the camera pulls back to reveal a landscape shaped by time. The world feels vast and ancient, while the Witcher countryside scene feels like actors walking through a location, not a world with millennia behind it. Neither of these scenes includes spectacle, because the comparison is not about CGI budgets or visual effects. It's something deeper, a level of immersion and authenticity that makes Middle-earth feel like a place you could step into, while much modern fantasy feels built for a camera. The Lord of the Rings feels real in a way few fantasy worlds do, and understanding why reveals everything about Tolkien's philosophy, his world-building, and the power of myth done right. When the Fellowship crosses the ruined watchtower of Amon Sul, Tolkien doesn't simply describe a location. He describes a wound in the land, broken stone, cold wind curling through shattered battlements, lichen crawling over ancient walls. It feels like the world has endured centuries of rain, frost, and the slow grinding weight of history. Compare this with many modern fantasy settings, beautiful, but often frictionless. Take Shadow and Bone, for instance. When Alina arrives at the little palace, the environment feels curated rather than aged. The stone surfaces are clean, the arches polished, the courtyards immaculate. There's little sense of weathering, no erosion, no discoloration, no uneven stonework shaped by decades of boots or storms. It's striking, but it lacks environmental resistance. Tolkien's world resists the characters. Modern fantasy often accommodates them, and this is crucial to perceptual realism. Even in the films, Peter Jackson leans heavily into this philosophy. The rocks of Emin Muil scrape wet skin. The wind at Edoras howls and pulls at cloaks. Everything behaves as if it belongs to the natural world. The result is a world that does not look lived in. It feels lived in. And that sensation is what makes Middle-earth immediately, intuitively real. Perceptual realism. A world you can feel with your body. Middle-earth behaves in ways your senses recognize. Tolkien builds realism not by explaining his world, but by making you inhabit it. Its cold, its weight, its texture. When the Fellowship crosses the snows of Caradhras, you don't simply see a mountain. You feel the sting of ice blowing sideways. You hear the crunch of snow under boots. The wind forces bodies to lean, hoods to snap back, cloaks to whip like wet sails. The environment isn't a backdrop. It pushes back, resisting every step. This sensory resistance is the essence of perceptual realism. Every chapter asks the reader to imagine the touch of Middle-earth. Now compare this with many modern fantasy scenes. Shadow and Bone, The Fold. When Alina and Mal cross the Shadow Fold, the environment is visually impressive. Thick gray clouds, swirling darkness, but it has little physical consequence. The wind doesn't pull at clothing. Lanterns glow cleanly in the murk rather than flickering in turbulent air. The scene is atmospheric, but the characters move as if the environment is neutral, not dangerous. Everything feels spatially safe, as though the environment has been flattened into a stage. These worlds are beautiful, but they often lack haptic detail. Nothing feels rough, wet, cold, or heavy. By contrast, in The Lord of the Rings, when Sam collapses in Mordor, dust bursts upward, clinging to sweat and cloth. The rocks beneath him are sharp. The air is visible with heat and ash. The body reacts to texture, and the environment reacts back. This is haptic visuality, what Laura Marks, media scholar and theorist, describes as the image acting like something you can touch with your eyes. It creates a sensory loop. You don't just see the world, you feel it. Middle-earth does this constantly. Modern fantasy does it occasionally, and that gap is one of the core reasons Lord of the Rings feels far more real. Magic that behaves like nature. Why Tolkien's magic feels real. If perceptual realism is about how a world engages the senses, Tolkien's magic succeeds because it does not interrupt that sensory logic. In Middle-earth, magic isn't a system, it's a condition of the world. It behaves like weather, music, light, memory, or will. Tolkien wrote, "Magic in my story is far from the vulgar devices of the laborious scientific magician." Magic should not behave like technology. It should behave like something that belongs to the fabric of nature. Magic in Middle-earth is environmental, not performative. When Gandalf confronts the Balrog on the bridge of Khazad-dûm, the power you witness is not a spell. The stone cracks because two ancient beings are exerting will against matter. The air distorts as heat and shadow collide. It feels physical. Even elvish enchantment works this way. The light of Arundel doesn't function like a spell. It behaves like a memory of starlight, concentrated and revealed. Its glow ripples through the air, the way real illumination reacts to surrounding textures. Nothing breaks the perceptual logic of the world. Modern fantasy often makes magic too visible. Compare this with the magic in more recent fantasy adaptations. Shadow and Bone, Alina's light burst. When Alina unleashes the cut or the sun summoner's burst in the fold, the light slices cleanly through darkness. But the environment doesn't push back, dust doesn't swell, wind doesn't rush outward, shadows don't warp according to the force. It's cinematic, but not sensory. This kind of magic is expressive, but not experiential. It prioritizes spectacle over sensory integration. Tolkien's magic is built to preserve believability. Tolkien understood something crucial. The moment magic becomes too explicit, the illusion of reality weakens. So Tolkien hides his magic inside the world itself. The glow of Lothlorien isn't presented as a visual effect, but as a subtle change in the quality of the air. Elvish craft, like the rope given to Sam, feels quietly alive with intention, useful and responsive without ever drawing attention to itself. Spells are not treated as mechanical actions, but as extensions of will, words spoken or sung as naturally as breath. And when an elf lord is revealed in wrath, the moment feels less like an eruption of power and more like a shift in gravity. Magic is not a set of rules. It is the soul of the world made perceptible. And because Tolkien's magic behaves like part of nature rather than a break from it, the viewer or reader never leaves the sensory reality of Middle-earth. That is why his world feels real, even when the supernatural appears. It's not magic as spectacle. It's magic as physics, magic as memory, magic as light, something your body can believe. Applicability, why Tolkien's stories feel experienced, not explained. The realistic feel of Middle-earth is not just because the landscapes feel tactile or the magic behaves like nature. It's also because Tolkien refuses to tell the reader what anything means. He makes you live the story, not interpret it. And this is where the realism deepens. Tolkien famously wrote in his foreword to The Lord of the Rings, "I cordially dislike allegory in all its manifestations. I much prefer history, true or feigned, with its varied applicability to the thought and experience of readers." Applicability is the key. Meaning emerges in the reader, not from the author. We go through events first, then we understand them, slowly, imperfectly, emotionally. Tolkien replicates that process in storytelling. He lets you feel before you understand. When Frodo collapses on the slopes of Mount Doom, Tolkien doesn't insert a paragraph explaining the moral weight of despair. It is written so you feel the burnt air rasping in Frodo's lungs, the ash sticking to his skin, and the feeling of the world shrinking to a tunnel of pain and effort. Meaning arrives only after the experience. Modern fantasy often removes that discovery. Compare Shadow and Bone, Alina's burden. Scenes often pause so characters can articulate what Alina represents: hope, unity, light. The emotion is discussed rather than embodied. Wheel of Time, Rand's destiny. Characters repeatedly explain prophecy, identity, and thematic meaning. Rand's transformation is narrated rather than felt through sensory degradation or psychological texture. Tolkien hides his themes the way nature hides laws. When Sam looks at a star in Mordor and feels hope, Tolkien doesn't say, "This symbolizes resilience." He writes, "The beauty of it smote his heart." No commentary, just experience, just the sensory truth of a cold, distant light piercing a poisoned sky. This is what makes the difference between the author dominating meaning and the reader finding their own path. Middle-earth feels believable because it allows emotional honesty without thematic instruction. Applicability strengthens perceptual realism. When a fantasy world explains itself, it feels constructed. When a fantasy world simply exists and you discover meaning through your own senses, it feels real. Tolkien's restraint creates the same effect you find in lived experience. This philosophical space, this freedom of interpretation, grounds Middle-earth more deeply than any visual technique ever could. Psychological realism. Characters who think and break like real people. In the same way the landscapes push back, the people inside those landscapes respond like actual human beings, emotionally, physically, and psychologically. Tolkien's characters are not driven by tropes or speeches. Their minds are shaped by exhaustion, weather, fear, memory, and culture, the same pressures that shape us. Tolkien grounds inner life in sensory reality. Frodo's deterioration is never framed as metaphor or destiny. It is experienced through the body. His lips crack from lack of water, his hands tremble until he can no longer hold lembas. The ring burns against his chest, volcanic ash cakes the back of his throat, and sleep fractures into fevered nightmares where even the sound of his own heartbeat becomes unbearable. This accumulation of physical detail makes Frodo's mental collapse feel inevitable. His psychology is not explained or announced, it is embodied. As Tolkien himself wrote, "The burned hand teaches best." Pain is not symbolic in Middle-earth. Pain gives shape to the world. Compare that to modern fantasy's psychological explanations. Modern fantasy often externalizes internal struggle. Shadow and bone, Alina's doubt. When Alina fears her growing power, characters verbalize it for her. She is told what she represents, and scenes frame her destiny through dialogue rather than silence, breath, or sensory collapse. The Witcher, Geralt's conflict. Geralt's morality is often clarified in sharp lines: lesser evil, greater evil, instead of through body language, hesitation, or environmental pressure. His psychology is stylized rather than emergent. In Tolkien's world, physical environments shape mental states. The outer world and the inner world mirror each other. Shelob's lair compresses space until it feels like a panic attack. Stale air, walls that seem to sweat, and a silence so dense it crushes the ears. The dead marshes distort perception through wavering light and dark water, creating dread without ever explaining it. In the films, this effect is amplified through cinematography. Wide, distant shots isolate characters within hostile terrain. Natural lighting casts real shadows that deepen emotional stakes. Long lenses compress space, so slopes feel steeper and journeys heavier. And sound design foregrounds wind, crunching stone, and water, externalizing internal strain. This is psychology delivered through perceptual realism. Characters don't feel the way the story instructs them to feel. They respond the way a human would when the world is cold, sharp, heavy, endless, and dangerous. Their mental states emerge from sensory pressure, not from dialogue. Boromir breaks not because the story needs tragedy, but because hunger, fear, duty, and proximity to power grind him down. And Sam rises not because he is a paragon, but because compassion fills the same space where despair should be. These are not archetypes. They are human responses to believable sensory conditions. Psychological honesty, grounded in texture, temperature, and terrain. Cinematic realism, how the Lord of the Rings films make the world physically believable. While Tolkien creates perceptual realism on the page, the Peter Jackson trilogy translates it into cinematic realism through camera placement, lighting, set design, environmental interaction, and lens choices that make Middle-earth feel like an unbroken physical world. This isn't nostalgia, it's technique. Camera distance and lens choice create spatial honesty. The Lord of the Rings films frequently use wide, deep focus lenses that hold both foreground and background in sharp detail. Look at the approach to the Gates of Argonath. The camera sits far back, letting the entire valley, river texture, cliff shadows, wind on water, fill the frame. You're scanning the image the same way you would scan a real landscape. This preserves three-dimensional truth, the same principle emphasized in perceptual realism research. Compare this to The Witcher, where many scenes use shallow depth of field and tight framing. When Geralt rides through a forest, the trees behind him blur into color bands. It's visually pretty, but the environment becomes abstract. You sense composition, not location. Shallow focus creates emotion. Deep focus creates place. Lord of the Rings uses both, but reserves the latter for world building. Lighting is natural, uneven, and physically motivated. Jackson often lights scenes using real sunlight, firelight, or bounced practical sources. This creates shadows that fall irregularly, highlights that shift as clouds move, and textures that come alive only under real light. Consider the beacon lighting sequence. The fires cast uneven orange glows across rock ridges, while cold blue mountain shadows swallow the edges of the frame. The lighting behaves like real distance and elevation, and this makes the world feel enormous. Now compare this to Shadow and Bone. When Alina first trains in the little palace courtyard, the lighting is soft, even, and cosmetically controlled. Faces have minimal shadow, and costumes glow without grit. It looks beautiful, but not lived in. There is no weather, no fluctuating light, no sense of air movement. Natural light introduces imperfection, which introduces reality. Peter Jackson's blocking and composition consistently emphasize place over spectacle. Characters are staged within their environment rather than in front of it. In the scene where the Fellowship watches the Crebain from Dunlin Wheel overhead, the camera holds back, revealing the full valley, mountains fading into atmospheric haze, and the characters themselves rendered small and vulnerable in the frame. The composition quietly communicates a single truth. The world is larger than the people moving through it. By contrast, much modern fantasy centers characters in close-up during major moments, with faces dominating the frame and backgrounds softened into blur. This heightens emotion, but sacrifices spatial truth. Sound design completes the illusion. The Lord of the Rings is filled with micro-details. Chainmail rustling, boots slipping on scree, distant thunder rolling across mountains, wind whistling through broken stone. These aren't decorative effects. They are environmental cues the brain uses to confirm reality. Many contemporary fantasy productions smooth over these sounds for clarity or drama, losing the roughness that makes a world feel inhabited. The result is that Lord of the Rings achieves a cinema of touch, not just sight. Middle-earth is treated as a physical geography with mass, temperature, texture, and resistance. And because it behaves the way the real world behaves, the viewer recognizes it instinctively through subconscious bodily memory rather than conscious analysis. In a time when many fantasy worlds lean toward spectacle, Middle-earth remains grounded in something older, quieter, and more human. The belief that a world should feel lived before it feels legendary. And that meaning, real meaning, is something the reader discovers for themselves. Middle-earth treats reality, not imagination, as its starting point. And that's why, decades later, we look at these landscapes, these characters, and still feel something ancient, something familiar, something true. To see how those figures shape the world just as powerfully, watch next, The Most Hated Characters in Lord of the Rings Explained.